Hey y'all, Father Jim Haney from St. Paul's in the Plains in Lubbock. This week is the feast day of one of the most popular saints in Western Christianity, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. Assisi is a town in the hills of Italy, about halfway between Rome and Florence, little off the main line road, but in the hills there. Francis lived late 1100s, early 1200s, so he overlapped people like Richard the Lionhearted and King John of England, Magna Carta, all that. That was Francis's time. Francis, though, didn't start out as an extremely religious person. He started out as the son of a wealthy cloth merchant in Assisi. He had kind of a wild lifestyle. He was kind of a wild kid. Spent a little time as a soldier, spent a little time as a prisoner of war. But then he started feeling these stirrings and these callings from God. And the callings especially focused around identifying with the poor. And Francis, in fact, gave away some of his dad's cloth to the poor. His dad was really upset about it. And as the story goes, it's contested a little bit, but as the story goes, Francis decided, well, if cloth's so important to you, Dad, and if you're worried about your possessions, everything on my back is yours, so here it is. And Francis stripped down naked in the town square, and the bishop apparently, as the story goes, took pity on him and gave Francis his cloak. But Francis returned everything he owned back to his father. Francis then lived a life of poverty, extreme poverty. He begged, but he really didn't. He didn't beg. He was too worried about people. They didn't want to take things from them or ask things from them, and so he really kind of rummaged through what we would call rummaging through dumpsters. The 13th century equivalent of doing that. He had a vision of he heard a voice of God in a little church that was in disrepair, and it said, Francis, rebuild my church. And he took that literally at the time and rebuilt the little chapel. But then later he thought, well, maybe it's more than just this one little church. Maybe God is calling me to breathe some new life into the church. Francis eventually had followers. St. Clare is one of his most famous followers. She is the founder of the female version of the Franciscan order. Francis died pretty young. I think if you live off scraps, your nutrition's not going to be very, very good, so he died pretty young. He's famous for his relationship with animals and creation. That's probably what he's most popular for in our culture. We see him on statues and things. This coming Sunday, we'll have a blessing of our pets at St. Paul's in honor of St. Francis. But it's said that St. Francis is perhaps one of the most admired saints and one of the least imitated. Very few of us are as radical in our following of Jesus as Francis is, to forsake everything to follow Jesus. Most of us are not called to that kind of extreme response, and yet there are some who are. And Francis certainly is an interesting example of that. On the Episcopal calendar, Francis's Day is not a major feast day. He's kind of like St. Patrick. He's one of the most popular of the minor saints. But October 4th every year is his feast day. And I love the prayer that's attributed to him. He lived in a world of war and difficulty and strife. This prayer is wonderful. It talks about a world of hatred and injury and discord and what our Christian response is. And the prayer goes, Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there's hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there's discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there's sadness, joy. Then the second sentence asks, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. And then the final sentence, for it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And perhaps that's the best legacy of St. Francis for the average Christian. We live in a world that's tough. We live in a world of hurt and hatred, and we can pray, like St. Francis, that God make us instruments of his peace, his light, his healing in a world that desperately needs it. So have a good St. Francis Day. God bless.